Romans 11, starting in verse number 1. I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I am an Israelite of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. Wot ye not, or don't you know what the scripture says of Elias or Elijah? How he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, Lord, they have killed thy prophets, and digged down thine altars. And I am left alone, and they seek my life. But what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men, who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. Even so then at this present time also there is a remnant according to the election of grace. And if by grace, then is it no more works. Otherwise grace is no more works. But if it be by works, then it is no more grace. Otherwise work is no more work. What then? Israel hath not obtained that which it seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. According as it is written, God hath given them a spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear, unto this day. And David saith, Let their table be made a snare, and a trap, and a stumbling block, and a recompense unto them. Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see, and bow down their back alway. I say then, have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid, but rather through their fall salvation is come unto the Gentiles, for to provoke them to jealousy. Now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify mine office. If by any means I may provoke to emulation or jealousy them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. For if the casting away of them be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? For if the first fruit be holy, the lump is also holy. And if the root be holy, so are the branches. And if some of the branches be broken off, and thou, being a wild olive tree, wert grafted in among them, and with them partakest of the root and fatness of the olive tree, boast not against the branches. But if thou boast, thou bearest not the root, but the root thee. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed lest he also not spare thee. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell, severity, but toward thee goodness, if thou continue in his goodness. Otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. And they also, if they abide not still in unbelief, shall be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again. For if thou wert cut off of the olive tree, which is wild by nature, and wert grafted contrary to nature into a good olive tree, how much more shall these, which be the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? For I would not, brethren, that ye should be ignorant of this mystery, lest ye should be wise in your own conceits, that blindness in part is happened to Israel, until the fullness of these Gentiles be come in. And so all Israel shall be saved. As it is written, there shall come out of Sion the deliverer, and shall turn away ungodliness from Jacob. For this is my covenant unto them, when I shall take away their sins. As concerning the gospel, they are enemies for your sakes, but as touching the election, they are beloved for the Father's sake. For the gifts and calling of God are without repentance. For as ye in times past have not believed God, yet have now obtained mercy through their unbelief, even so have these also now not believed, that through your mercy they also may obtain mercy. For God hath concluded them all in unbelief, that he might have mercy upon all. All right, so that's a lot of verses going on here in Romans chapter 11. A lot of content that God is sharing here. Now, we really see two specific groups of people that Paul is discussing in this chapter. Who are the two groups of people that we are seeing explicitly mentioned? The Israelites are the Jews and the Gentiles. Israel and Gentiles. So Israel and not Israel, right? So we have those two groups of people that Paul is kind of building a contrast against. Now, if you remember back to chapter 10, we looked at this last week, and we looked at quite a few verses that we all know, we've all heard many times over, but we looked at them more in context about Israel and what they're going to do with Jesus Christ and how they need to acknowledge who Jesus is and call upon him in that, right? Then we looked at those famous verses, how shall they call on him in whom they have not believed, and how shall they believe in him in whom they have not heard, and how shall they hear without a preacher, and how shall they preach except they be sent, as it is written, how beautiful are the feet. And basically, Paul makes an argument that Israel has heard. If all of these things are required for Israel to believe in a call, well, Paul says Israel has heard because God has sent messengers to declare the truth about who Jesus is. Israel's lack of belief is not for lack of knowledge, hearing, and it's not for lack of understanding. Paul lays that out in our passage previously. In verse 19, but I say, did not Israel, verse 18, but I say, have they not heard? Yes, verily, they heard, right? Verse 19. But I say, did not Israel know? That's a rhetorical question. Yes, they did know. It was there. And so he talks about Moses saying, hey, Moses writing down in the first 5 books in the Torah, Moses says, I will provoke you to jealousy by them that are no people, and by a foolish nation I will anger you. Now that's a very important verse, because that same thought, if you were listening in chapter 11, kind of is reoccurring all throughout chapter 11. That same idea of being provoked to jealousy by God's interaction with a people that aren't a people. What's going on there? And then he says in verse 20, but Isaiah is very bold and said, I was not found of them that sought me not. I was found of them that sought me not. The Gentiles didn't seek after God, but yet somehow the Gentiles now have a relationship with God. I was made manifest unto them that asked not after me. Again, the same idea. But to Israel, in contrast, he says, all day long I have stretched forth my hands. That's how we ended it. God saying, hey, wait a second. I am a merciful God. I, despite your constant rejection of me, Israel, have never ceased to hold out my arms to you, to welcome you. I'm very reminiscent of the prodigal son story, right? And the father in that story, how he immediately welcomed the son back. I'm preaching through that passage tomorrow for the Korean church, and I'm excited to walk through and just take a look at who the father was in that story and how he demonstrates the love of God as our father. And that's exactly what we see here in Romans 10:21. So that leads us into Romans chapter 11. It's a little bit of context there. And so here in Romans chapter 11, starting in verse number 1, I say then, Paul asks the question, hath God cast away his people? So here's where we start. So what is Paul doing here? What are you recognizing about this verse? What's a question that we should be asking here? What's an observation that would be natural to make reading Romans 11:1? There are a couple ones that come to my mind that if we've been paying attention throughout the book of Romans should jump out at you right away if you can connect back to earlier in our chapter.
Uses that God forbid thing to insert God. It's that really strong word or verbiage he's using. And I like what he's doing, what Paul is doing here too, because then he uses his Israelite heritage.
Yeah, so let's hold on to that for just a second because we want to get there. But right there at the beginning, as Garrett pointed out, Paul asks a question and then immediately he responds with that same response we see all throughout Romans, God forbid. Now remember, this is an emphatic negative. If you read the Greek here, this is actually like a translation where in Greek, Paul did not say God forbid. He more said emphatically no, and absolutely not, or that this is not the case, right? An Englishism, if you will, that we would sometimes say is God forbid or no way, right? By no means. That's the idea here. So Paul is asking a rhetorical question, then immediately answering by saying, no, 1,000 times no, this is not the case, right? And so that's not a new way of Paul communicating. This is very much a reoccurring theme that he does there. And then Garrett kind of alluded to this earlier, but what do we see kind of coming after? Now, this isn't necessarily, Paul does this a couple other places in Romans, but not just in Romans. Paul does this in other portions of his writing. What does Paul immediately do as an answer to his question, has God cast away his people, or has God abandoned Israel? Has he gotten rid of them? What does Paul do immediately after that? How does he answer this question? Yeah, Garrett was starting to walk down this house before I stopped him. I didn't want to get too far here. But Paul says, no, God has not. How does Paul know that? Because I'm an Israelite, right? He says, look, I am a Jew of the seed of Abraham. So what's he saying here? Why does he say the seed of Abraham? He's the father of the Jews. But what is the explicit point he's trying to make by saying, I'm of the seed of Abraham? I can see you, I just can't hear you. He's one of them, yeah. But he's saying, I'm an ethnic Jew. By birth, I'm not a Jew because I joined this nation. I'm not a Jew because I chose their religion. I'm a Jew because I was born a Jew. If you sent a sample of Paul's DNA to 23andMe, it would come back Jewish, right? Middle Eastern Jewish. There's no question about that, right? So that's the idea. He's saying, I am a Jew ethnically, but then he also says, I am a Jew in the way I lived, in his next statement, of the tribe of Benjamin. So not is he only an ethnic Jew, but he's a Jew because he has tracked his lineage. At this time, as the Jews had been dispersed and then brought back and now dispersed again through persecution and the Roman Empire taking over, more and more they were losing their heritage. They knew they were Jewish ethnically, but they were starting to lose their Jewish heritage by being able to track which tribes that they were coming from. And that was a big part of their culture, because the tribe that you were part of, I mean, it's like for those of you who are Filipino, being able to say, well, I'm Ilocano, I'm Cebuano, right? It's that same idea. You can kind of track your location, what people group within the nation you're a part of. But he's saying, hey, I'm such a Jew. Not only do I know I'm ethnically a Jew by birth, I'm of the seed of Abraham, but I'm also of the tribe of Benjamin. I'm able to actually track my heritage. So I'm not just some nobody, I'm a Jew's Jew. Paul does this as well back in Philippians chapter 3, if you remember. If you ever want to see what Paul really thinks about his Jewish heritage, and compared to what he writes here in Romans, go read the beginning of Philippians 3, where he lists out all the things that all the Jews would be really impressed with. And he says, yeah, and it's all dung. It's all cow manure. It might as well be taken out in the fields and spread to fertilize the corn, right? That's what he says it's worth to him. It's worthless in comparison to him knowing Christ, right? So Paul isn't relying on his Jewishness, but he's saying that God has not abandoned the Jews, because he says, I'm a Jew and I am saved. I'm a living testimony of who God is and what he's done. Well, where does he go from here? He goes into verse 2. God hath not cast away his people which he foreknew. Right? These are the people that God had chosen. Remember back in chapter 9, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Right? He has chosen this people. This is important. These people are important to him. And then he says, don't you know what the scripture says of Elias or Elijah? How he maketh intercession to God against Israel, saying, and then he quotes an Old Testament passage, Lord, they have killed thy prophets and digged down thine altars, and I am left alone, and they seek my life. You guys remember that story from Elijah? I'm trying to find the exact the passage here. It's in 1 Kings 19, verses 10 and verse 14, if you want to write that down. But Elijah was a prophet in the Old Testament and during a very dark time for the nation of Israel. The king's name was Ahab, and maybe you don't recognize his name as much as you would recognize his wife's name, Jezebel. Yeah, don't name your daughter Jezebel, okay? That's a bad idea. She was not a good lady. But they brought in worship of the false idol Baal into Israel, and they had hundreds of prophets of Baal, and they were worshiping this false god, and they were leading Israel down a dark, dark path. And Elijah was the prophet who stood up and boldly preached against King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and preached against Baal and condemned their actions. And man, did he get them riled up. He made King Ahab mad, but he especially made Jezebel mad. And Jezebel literally made a task force, if you will, of men to go and try to capture Elijah, to hunt him down and to kill him. And she was never successful. But Elijah, man, he got exhausted, right? And he comes to a point where he says, God, I am the only one left. He kind of has this little pity party for himself. You guys remember the story? He has this little pity party for himself, and he's kind of whining to God. And he says, God, I'm the only one left, and they're seeking me to kill me. I'm the last one standing for you remaining, and I'm about to die if they find me. And what does God say to him? If we look here in verse number 4, but what saith the answer of God unto him? I have reserved to myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to the image of Baal. God says, Elijah, come on. Get off of it. You're having a pity party, but this just is not true. God says to Elijah, you're not alone. There is many, many people still around. What's cool about this story, a complete aside, is I love how God handles Elijah. God literally looks at Elijah and goes, go over there, sit down, eat some food, take a nap, then we'll talk, right? Sometimes that's the best, most spiritual thing that you can do is eat some food, take a nap, right? Half the arguments we have wouldn't happen if we would just eat first, right? But God says to Elijah, hey, there's still 7,000. And Paul is using this as an illustration. So where is Paul going with that thought? Why does he bring up this story of Elijah, Jensen? Oh, yeah, that's a great question to ask.
Almost, and just reflecting on just what he has said in the past in Romans, it almost sounds like this church, Jews and Gentiles, that there was this form of jealousy
Mhm.
between them and God. Like God was like, no, he's my dad. He's my dad first. And it's almost childish.
Yeah.
Like they're like, well, and it almost seems like there was this attitude of, well, you guys were the ones that killed Jesus, so, and even in medieval times, like Jewish people amongst Christians were like, ugh, because they're the ones that killed Jesus. But it almost seems that there was this childish fight between who was their heavenly Father and who God
Yeah.
feared most.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a good point that you brought that up because 100% we know the context of Romans. There was this interchurch conflict going on between the Jews and the Gentiles, and the Jews, clearly Paul was reprimanding the Jews, and from chapter 1 on, he's sitting here going, hey, stop relying on your Jewishness. You're no different than the Gentile. Yes, in fact, if anything, you're more condemned than the Gentile because of your standing with God and your relationship with God. And then these last couple chapters, Paul has spent quite a bit of time and effort really condemning the Jews, right? Chapter 9 and 10 specifically just pointing out, hey, Jews, you were chosen by God, and yet you as a nation, all of you guys rejected God holistically, right? As a people group, you guys stood up against God and crucified Jesus Christ, and that's a problem, right? And so there's this little bit of that, oh no. And that's why Paul asks that question at the beginning. So has God rejected Israel? Well, no, because that goes absolutely, if number one, against or has God cast away his people? Like saying, well, I don't have anything to do with them whatsoever. Well, no, God is always standing there with open arms. He doesn't cast them away. He's waiting for them to come to him. But there's still a plan for Israel in place. But there's kind of a twofold thing that's going on here. There is a jealousy. I like how Jensen put that way. And we're going to see this a little bit later. Paul's going to, a little bit later in our passage, say to the Gentiles, hey, hold up. Don't you start getting arrogant. And what seems to have happened here in the churches in Rome is that the script kind of got flipped. Whereas the Gentiles became the majority of the church, now they were the ones kind of arrogantly lording themselves over the Jews and saying, well, now it's our time to shine. And so you no longer matter. And Paul says, wait a second, that's not how this plays out. There is always going to, and what we kind of see Paul building towards here is there's always going to be a remnant of Jews that are Christians, that are a part of the kingdom in every age. God is always going to reserve himself a portion of the house of Israel. And how Israel plays into God's master plan is what Paul is kind of unpacking here for us, at least giving us a small window into it. But yeah, this back and forth conflict is absolutely existing, this jealousy of, he's my dad, right? That was a great way of putting it. So we see as Paul builds into verse number 5, even so at this present time also, there is a remnant according to the election of grace. Paul says, even right now, in response to verse 1, I say then, hath God cast away his people? Well, no. Even so at this present time, there is still a number of Jews. He doesn't put an actual number on that, but Paul says there is a remnant. Just like in Elijah's time, God had reserved for himself 7,000 people who had not bowed the knee to Baal. In one of the darkest moments in Israel's history, there were still thousands of Jews that were standing up for God. Paul says there's still that same thing today. God has clearly articulated that the Jewish people have not been cast away. They are still coming to God for salvation. What a great, inspiring thought to remember that God did not abandon his people. He didn't put them away on the shelf for good. He said, hey, as a nation, they've walked away from me, but there is still a portion of them that has stayed faithful and that has followed after me. Verse number 6, and if by grace, then it is no more of works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace, but it be of works. Then is it no more grace. Otherwise, work is no more work. Okay, that's a confusing statement right there. Anybody have a thought about what's going on there? Anyone want to take a crack at that? There's a little bit going on. Don't be afraid to think about it a little bit too.
My guess is like, without grace, there's only work.
Okay. Well, okay, so we have this contrast, right? We have grace and we have works. And without grace, well, there's only one option, works. And as Paul has told us before in Romans, works and grace don't mix. And that's what he's reiterating here. If we could say this a little more simply, he's saying, hey, if it's by grace, then it's not works. And if it's by works, it's not grace. You can't have a little bit of grace and a little bit of works. They don't mix. The salvation that has been brought to the Jewish people, the remnant that remains, is salvation that's from God alone. It's not their effort of keeping the law and their works. It's not anything that they have done other than God showing grace to them as a people and continuing to allow them to be saved. No differently than he allows any of us to be saved, except for the fact that this is God's chosen people from the very beginning, as we saw back in chapter 9. And so we look at a verse like this, and it's a little confusing, and probably a lot of that is just the difficulty of translating from Greek into English. But hey, if by grace, then it's no more works. It can only be grace if it's by grace. It does not have works. Otherwise, grace is no more grace. If you add any amount of works to grace, it ceases to be grace. That's what Paul says there. But if it be of works, then it is no more grace. If you add any amount of grace to works, it's no more works. Those two cannot coexist. Otherwise, work is no more work, right? Any other thoughts on that? Or that was a good start there, Puna. I love that. And way to take a crack at it. Puna's braver than the rest of you guys. I'm just kidding. Let's keep going. Paul, again, well, what do we see here? What then? Okay, that's been a repeated idea. Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. That is an interesting statement. Let's unpack that a little bit, especially that first half. Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for. What do you think is that statement about? What is Paul trying to point out for us here? Okay. They didn't obtain the grace after they were seeking it. I like where you're going there. You're thinking. You're trying to connect it back to the verse previously. It's a good... She said that Israel hasn't obtained the grace that they were seeking for. I think you're thinking really well there. I get where you got... Say that again? Or working for. Okay, yep. Or working for. I like how you pulled that works, and they were working for it. Okay. Well, yeah, they didn't find what they were looking for. Think back to chapter 10. And chapter 9, actually. But remember how Paul outlined that, and we talked about this. I'm trying to remember which verse it was in. We talked about this last week, how Israel had a desire to know God. Right? I remember where it was. It was at the very end of chapter 9. But Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not, chapter 9, verse 31, hath not attained to the law of righteousness. Remember, they were chasing it. It was like a foot race, and they were running after that law of righteousness. They were trying to obtain it. And what happened as they were trying to chase it? What did Paul say? They stumbled, right? They stumbled over Jesus. So there was an attempt. Israel as a nation, Paul calls them he here, like he kind of personifies them as a nation. Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for. They were seeking to know God. They were seeking to have a relationship, right? They wanted that religiousness, that idea there of, we want to go after what makes it feel good to keep the law, right? But they were going it after in a way of works, like Puna pointed out, or Puna and Jensen both. They were trying to accomplish it through works, which is what Paul was pointing out over and over and over again for us. Their works of the law could not get them there, only an acceptance of Jesus Christ and the grace that he offers. And so here Paul says, hey, Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for. Why else is that statement significant compared to where we've come from at the end of chapter 10? We read these verses at the beginning. Remember, we don't do any of this in isolation. We keep all this contextually in our minds because Paul is building his thoughts on top of each other. So what else did Paul say here that we could connect into this thought? Look at the very end of chapter 10, verses 20 and 21. He harkens back to a writing of Isaiah. I was found of them that sought me not. I was made manifest unto them that asked not after me. Right? Sorry, just verse 20, not 21. But here in verse 7 of chapter 11, Israel hath not obtained that which he seeketh for. So there's a contrast. It's not immediately next to each other, but Paul talks about the nation that was not a nation, a people that was not a people, right? who found, Isaiah prophesies from God, right? He says, God says that God was found by people who weren't even looking for him. Well, the children of Israel were seeking after a form of God or a form of godliness, but didn't obtain it. So it's an interesting comparison of those two that's happening there, those two statements. And Paul goes on to say, but the election hath obtained it, and the rest were blinded. Okay, this is a difficult statement. What do you oh, Jensen, go ahead.
Well, I was just connecting that verse where he's talking about Israel trying to be not obtaining, but then there is a reserved section, and then the rest are blinded. I think he's still alluding to about Elias and the prophets, and how some of them, like, was having a pity party. God said, no, there is a group that you just don't know about, that you're just so narrow-minded.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think that he's still, in present time, God is still just the same God in that story. God also is still showing himself faithful.
Yeah.
That just because, they can't see it, there is a group of people, and the rest were made to suffer. They're just like in that old story that he was.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Very jagged because I didn't have my thoughts.
No, but absolutely. God is faithful in every generation, right? And so in Elijah's time, God was faithful, and that Elijah was not the only one still standing for God like he tried to claim he was, right? And now Paul is saying, and you Jews that are saved, you're not alone. God is still, by grace, giving salvation to Jews, right? Through the election. Well, Paul says, I'm one of them, right? And so you see that back in verse 5, right? That's what he alludes to. There is a remnant according to the election of grace. And then here in 7, Israel hath not obtained, Israel as a whole hasn't obtained that which he seeketh for, but the election, or those Jews who are saved, hath obtained it by grace, right? By the grace of God, they've received that salvation, and the rest have been blinded. The rest of Israel has been blinded. They've rejected God. And even today, you see that as a whole, the Jewish nation has rejected Jesus Christ. I should say Jesus Christ, not God, to be clear, to be articulate. Yes, we know Jesus is God. But it's not that they rejected God. They still see God as the God of the Old Testament, and they're still waiting for the Messiah, the one that's already come, right? And so they have been blinded in that way. Well, we keep going in verse number 8, according as it is written, so another reference to an Old Testament scripture, God hath given them the spirit of slumber, eyes that they should not see, and ears that they should not hear unto this day. And so, let me see, I got that. That comes from Isaiah 29:10, which says, for the Lord hath poured out upon you a spirit of deep sleep, and has closed your eyes, the prophets, and covered your heads, the seers. So there's this idea of prophecy that God says, hey, down the road, I'm going to give you this spirit of slumber. You're going to be put to sleep, so to speak, because of your rejection of me. I'm going to keep you from being able to accept me. That's what God tells them. And God dealt harshly with Israel because of their rejection of him time and time again. And that was part of his prophecy there. He continues on in verse number 9, and David saith, let their table be made a snare and a trap and a stumbling block and a recompense unto them. So here we have in verse number 9, we're citing from Psalms 69 verses 22 and 23, let their own table before them become a snare, and when they are at peace, let it become a trap. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and make their loins tremble continually. Okay, some interesting language there. That's very poetic, but someone want to try to take a crack at deciphering the idea of that poetry there? What is being said by David in the Psalms there? Let their table become a snare, let their peace become a trap. Your mind's going to be blown. I think the idea that David's getting at here is when you're eating dinner at your own table, it's one of your most comfortable places you could possibly be. Right? You're at peace, right? When you go home and you sit down at your dad's dinner table, right? It's the best feeling ever. You feel like you belong. You're not worried about anything. You're at home. You're at peace. And David says, let that peace be turned into a snare, a trap. God's prophecy here is that when the Israelites feel most locked in, right? Where do the Jewish people feel most locked in, most at home, most like, yeah, this is where we belong? Not quite church, more like the temple, right? The idea of worship, the temple worship and following the law and things like that. But what has God done to that? He's put it behind them.
It's interesting because they're, Israel did become its own nation. It's own place. And now that they have it, and finally people were flocking back, all the Jews were going back home, and they could be an actual people with land. And now that they're there, now they're under attack. And now it's always a dispute. They're never at peace. They're always, because of what their ancestors had done and what they still continually do, it's like prophecy, like you see it on the news.
Yeah. Well,
That coming true.
yeah, I think in the simplest words we can say is that the harder the Jewish people try to return to the customs of the law, the more of a trap it is to themselves. Right? The more desperately they try to hold on to the Old Testament way of living and continuously and in that continue to reject Jesus Christ as the Savior, as the Messiah, the promised one that God had told them clearly, as we saw in chapter 10, is God was not at fault for them not knowing. God says, I made it clear, and we can go through the prophets and see that God did for sure make it clear. But as long as they continue to reject Jesus and go after where they're comfortable in their religion of the law, that's a bigger trap, a snare for them. David, in verse 10, continuing to go to Psalm 69, let their eyes be darkened that they may not see, and bow down their back always. They're always going to be blinded. They're always going to be oppressed. Verse 11, I say then, okay, here's another one of those similar statements. Have they stumbled that they should fall? God forbid. Have they stumbled that they should fall? What are your thoughts there? What do you guys think is being said there? I'm loving that I'm starting to get a couple more of you guys involved here. I'm liking that a lot. Don't be afraid of it. Well, let me say this real quick before you answer. I'm going to give you that opportunity. Giving a wrong answer is not an embarrassment. Answering and starting to work through things is how we figure stuff out. And as we speak things aloud, sometimes we realize, okay, that made sense in one way, but as I speak it aloud and someone else gets an opportunity to respond, it helps us to see, oh, yeah, that's what I was missing there. Because holistically, any one of us do this on our own. That's why I don't sit here and just read the Bible by itself and only go with whatever thoughts I come up with. I go and I look at other scholars and what they've seen, and those other scholars are taking other scholars and taking what they've seen, right? So the whole idea of us sitting in a circle together is saying, hey, we're going to work through this together. That's why we even do small groups afterwards every week. So, okay, go ahead, Garrett. Sorry for interrupting you.
So Paul's asking basically, have they fallen beyond the point of recovery?
Yeah, have they fallen beyond the point of recovery? That's what Paul's rhetorical question is here. And what does he again say? God forbid. Absolutely not. That is not the case. They have not fallen, but rather through their fall, salvation is come unto the Gentiles for to provoke them to jealousy. What a statement there. That's an incredible statement. What Paul is doing is he's giving us insight into salvific historical context here. Paul is showing us that God has used the rejection of Israel towards him to bring the good news of the gospel. That was rhetorical. To bring the good news of the gospel, because the gospel means good news. Anyways, to bring the gospel into the whole world and to bring salvation to everybody who's not a Jew. Right? God is saying, I did more through the Israelites' rejection than anybody ever thought could be possible. And Paul is saying, you Gentiles now should be thankful for what God has done through the Jews' rejection. But that was a part of God's plan. not outside of God's purview where he had to scramble to utilize it, but a part of his plan from the beginning. Through their fall, salvation has come unto the Gentiles to provoke them to jealousy, to provoke the Jews to jealousy. We saw that earlier on, remember? All the way back in, that was back in chapter 10, where he talked about, verse number 19, but I say, did not Israel know? First Moses saith, I will provoke you to jealousy by them that are no people, and by a foolish nation I will anger you. And so Paul has this reoccurring theme of jealousy that's playing out right now. Verse number 12. Now if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Okay, I'm going to try to explain a couple of concepts here. Then I want you to think about what are the implications of Paul's statement. So he says, now if the fall of them, the Jews, be the riches of the world, what does that mean? I want you to think about that. And the diminishing of them, the Jews, the riches of the Gentiles, how much more their fullness? Their fullness is when the fullness of the kingdom comes and God has completed what he's doing through the nation of Israel. So when basically Paul is saying, God's not done with the Jews. He didn't cast them away. God's not done with the Jews. They have not fallen beyond redemption. They stumbled that they should fall. No, he's saying that there's going to be something that's incredible that's going to happen through them, and it is already happening through them. So what has happened now is good. Well, what's going to happen in the future when God completes his plan is even better. So what are the ideas here? Now, if the fall of them be the riches of the world, and the diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much more the fullness? What are some ideas there? Fall of them being the worldly desires. Okay. Kind of the idea, well, I'll get to you in a second. Kind of the idea of the Jews going more in a worldly direction. Okay. And then what were you saying, be the riches of the world? Meaning they're going after the world's riches? Okay, I see where you're coming from that. Okay. Jay?
It made me think of how they were blinded to see Jesus as the Messiah. And because of that, they crucified him, and the whole world, through his crucifixion and his resurrection, gained grace.
Salvation. Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I understand where you're coming from. That's a good thought. I see what you're thinking. So here, the riches of the world is more of in a positive sense, because you were thinking the riches of the world in a negative sense. But I like that you took that. I definitely see where you're coming from. I didn't even think about that in the negative sense. That's creative. But here, I think Paul is being more in a positive sense. Riches to the world, like the world was given a rich blessing, right? And I think you gave a great illustration of that. Okay, because of the Jews' rejection of Jesus, Jesus was now crucified and resurrected and brought salvation. Okay, that's a great first step to it. Well, what else, Jensen?
I think it's too fancy when he's asking these questions and then he's like repainting it. But he asked the question, so is the point of their stumbling so that they fail? But no, there is value in their failure in that sense, or in their moment of failure, that like what JJ said, that their failure isn't pointless. It's not like a boo shame on you, because boo shame on you, we get to
Yeah.
from their failure. So it's not necessarily that failure, it's a good thing. Their failure or their stumbling is a good thing, which is weird, but we agree with that because of their failure.
Yeah, we have benefited from their failure, right? So if the fall of them be the riches of the world, it brought salvation to the world because of their rejection, right? And the diminishing of them, meaning they've been put aside, right? So kind of think about it historically. What kind of happened? So the Jewish people rejected Jesus as the Messiah and crucified him, which was exactly the plan from the beginning. So, but they crucified him, which allowed him to fulfill the Father's plan and be resurrected and bring salvation. I mean, that's the gospel right there. But then where did the spreading of the gospel begin? In Israel. right? It began in Jerusalem, the day of Pentecost, and thousands of people getting saved, and those churches growing and causing problems there in Israel because of how they were turning the world upside down. But what began to happen pretty quickly after that? As many people as got saved, what's the larger story? The church pretty quickly moved out of Israel, right? It was incredible revivals for sure, but holistically, there was still a rejection of the gospel by the nation of Israel. And they were pushed out of Israel into the outer worlds. Where is Paul writing to? Is he writing to a church in Israel somewhere? No. He's writing to a church in Italy, in Rome. Many churches down there. And a majority now of Gentile believers, no longer a majority of Jewish, but a majority of Gentile believers. And so the Jews have started to be diminished in the holistic idea of what the church is. I mean, now as we look at it today, are there Jewish people who are part of churches? Oh, absolutely, 100%. But is that the majority? By no means is it the majority, right? And so by the fall of them, their rejection of Jesus becomes the riches of the world, right? So because of their transgressions, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. That's what we saw in verse 11. And now here in verse 12, because of their transgression, we have riches for the world. And their loss, the diminishing of them, we have riches for the Gentiles. Now the gospel focus comes more to Gentile nations. And then their full inclusion, or that last statement, how much more their fullness, when Israel as a nation is brought back fully into God's plan, greater riches. God says if things are as great right now as Israel has been put aside, think about how great it's going to be when God completes his plan and brings them back in. And Paul is alluding to a more long-term eschatological kind of end times view here. Jensen, did you have a thought that you wanted to share? Oh, you were raising your hand earlier. While I was talking, yes. Okay, never mind. Was that? Okay, I'm sorry. Verse 13, for I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify my office. Okay, really simple statement here that Paul is making. He's just saying, hey, I'm not coming to you as a Jew. I'm coming to you as the one that's the apostle. I'm a missionary to the Gentiles, right? That's my office. That's what God has called me to. Interestingly enough, if you've ever heard someone really try to make big on how Saul, when he got saved, he changed his name to Paul. Well, that's not really a thing. Saul was Paul's Jewish name. And so if Paul were in a Jewish context, Paul was not his name, it was Saul. That was his Hebrew name. Paul is a Roman name. And so when Paul got called to go and preach the gospel to the Gentiles, or to the Greeks, the Romans, Paul went by his Roman name. You guys do this to us. You give us an English name a lot of times, right? But you have a Korean name a lot of times as well. And it's the same thing here. Your mom and dad doesn't call you by your English name, right? Or other Koreans. If you have that same thing, you maybe have a more ethnic name that you go by, or you have an English name, right? Same idea. You go by it with the people that you're trying to reach. That's exactly what happened to Paul. And here he says, for I speak to you Gentiles. You're my focus when I'm talking right now, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. I magnify my office. This is what I'm called to. He's not saying I'm arrogant. He's saying I am called to this. And so what does he say? Verse 14, if by any means I may provoke to emulation or jealousy, that word there, them which are my flesh, and might save some of them. Okay, so verse 13 and 14, man, we're already pretty late. What is Paul doing here? Mm-hmm.
Trying to use that office to make his brothers jealous, or at least some of them, not all of them.
Yeah, he's trying to use his office to make his brothers jealous. Can someone unpack that a little more specific way? Really unpack kind of walk us through what Paul says here. You want to take a crack at it? I see the wheels turning. Hey, I like that you guys are thinking, because, like I said, it shouldn't always just be you listening to my thoughts. I want you guys to be thinking and working through this yourselves too.
Somehow make the people
He's trying to make the people of Israel jealous of what the Gentiles have. Okay? And what's he using to do that? JJ?
So that some of them are coming to Christ.
Well, yeah, because he wants them to come to Christ, and that's what the prophecy is, right? So Paul says, I magnify my office as an apostle to the Gentiles. He says, I've been called to preach the gospel to the Gentiles. But Paul says, my heart is for my brothers and sisters still, though. My Jewish brethren. Not my brothers and sisters in Christ, my brothers and sisters by blood. And so he says, because I believe the prophecy of God, how the gospel being spread to non-Jewish people will provoke the Jews to jealousy. I believe that, Paul says. And so I take my role as the apostle to the Gentiles seriously. So what Paul is saying, he's saying, I believe what God said. So I believe that the more Gentiles come to know God and to take him up on his fullness of salvation and to come to know him in the way that they didn't seek after, but what yet God has brought to them in love. What should have been what should have been belonging to the Jews has now been given to the Gentiles. Paul says, I'm going to work to make that come into fruition through the calling that I have so that it will take effect on my Jewish brothers and sisters. You see what he's saying there? We understand it a little more? Does someone have a question about that? Because to me, that's like really cool little thing to see there.
I think it's very eye-opening. Kind of like, oh, Paul's role in what he's doing, and is very significant.
Yeah, Paul's role is very significant.
We are reading from Paul's ministry. God has used him. If God has not used him, the Gentiles would not be able, to this day, many generations later, enough years later, we would not be able to know. But knowing that our salvation and God's blessing in our lives is still part of God's plan to redeem his people.
Yeah.
And I just think that is such a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Did you catch what she said there? Paul, we've all reaped the benefit of Paul's ministry, but even more than that, what God is doing in our lives has a significant role in what God is going to do in the nation of Israel in the future. Because we are Gentiles, right? So as God continues to give us the blessings of salvation, that continues to build jealousy in the nation of Israel as a part of his prophecy in the Old Testament. And so as we come into the fullness of our relationship with God, it is a greater fulfillment of God's prophecy. How many of you think that's pretty cool? Like, that's a really cool thing to think about. And that's exactly what Paul is saying here. He's saying, I take this seriously because I know the role it plays in the prophecy that God has given. Verse 15, for if the casting away of them, Israel, shall be the reconciling of the world, what shall the receiving of them be but life from the dead? Okay, we're going to have to stop here just for sake of time, but Paul there is, again, alluding back to a similar statement as what he said earlier in verse number 12. Hey, Israel's been cast away, and as a result, the world has been reconciled. Right? That's a good thing. And it's going to be an even better thing when Israel gets received back in, when they come back into the fold. And Paul's going to illustrate this in a second here with the illustration of a lump, kind of an idea of like a bread starter almost, or of a root and branches. We're going to see how he uses that next week, and I'm going to have my work cut out for me next week to get through these passages. So we're ready for Brother Brandt when not next week, 2 weeks. But you guys seeing a little more what Paul's doing here? I know we walked through this a little more slowly, but I hope that you guys were made to think a little more too. Okay, before we close it out and we go to like some more small groups, because I want to give you guys some opportunity in a smaller setting still to unpack this amongst yourselves and to share. Are there any questions that you guys have here on what we were able to cover tonight, or any just last minute thoughts? Go for it. I love it.
It was when you were speaking about Isaiah, you said that God pulled away from the people so they couldn't come to them. That would have, like, did he stop them from knowing who he was?
Okay, so we have two different ideas here. So let me read to you this quote. Looking at that first section there, the overriding principle of God's grace, his absolute freedom to act as he wishes without any creaturely constraint is seen here. There's the statement about the Jews that had not believed have been hardened by God, right? And that's a reoccurring statement throughout Romans, right? God's grace means that those who become his people owe nothing to their own accomplishments or works and owe everything to God. So there's this kind of contrast that's going on here. When we come to God, it's not us. It's God's grace that draws us. Nobody can get saved. And here's the truth. Whether you would consider yourself a Calvinist, and if you don't even know what these terms mean, don't even worry about it, frankly, but whether you consider yourself a Calvinist or whether you consider yourself someone who's free will in your view of salvation, either way, the Bible is absolutely clear that no person can get saved unless God calls them by grace first, right? It is nothing of ourselves. We are totally depraved. And I don't think anybody can be in any way, shape, or form biblical and deny that. Right? We are all totally depraved. We have nothing in ourselves that draws us to God, aside from God's grace drawing us to himself. However, that being said, that's what Paul is asking in the beginning, right? Or did God cast them away so they couldn't? Well, Paul says right at the end of chapter 10, but to Israel he saith, all day long I have stretched forth my hands unto a disobedient and gainsaying people. So there absolutely is a little bit of this tension that's going on here. And Pastor Byrne talked about this when he preached through a couple of sections for us a couple weeks ago. But there is a tension. And Paul is going to highlight this even at the end of chapter 11. He's going to say, look, oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his ways past finding out. Paul says, look, there is an element about how God is handling all of this that we cannot know or understand because that's what makes him God. And so no matter where we fall from a theological standpoint on our belief there is an idea that God has made decisions in this whole process that we don't fully understand. What is clear is that Israel has rejected God as a whole. But yet God has chosen that in every generation there will always be a remnant of Jews that are saved. And that God, in his grand plan, in the end times, when everything comes to a head, right, that a large portion of Israel will come back to him in salvation. That he will redeem a portion of the nation that he refers to, and we'll see it. He calls them all. He's not saying every Jew that exists will be saved at that time. He's saying that there will be enough to be considered the whole nation, so to speak, just like as we see in the Old Testament. So it's not that. I think we can get ourselves into some weird theological conversations, and I'm happy to have those if we want to sit here and talk about, well, did God specifically harden their heart, or did he allow their heart to be hardened by themselves? I think that's going down a path. But what is clear is that God's mercy and grace exists to those who desire him, and that his grace is called, and that anybody who comes to him comes by his grace alone. That he has the freedom to choose because he's God, but he also has an aspect of him that Paul clearly points out that we cannot understand. Where that line is the big debate. And so those are hard questions, no matter where you are. And people argue this and study this for years, for literally their whole lifetime, and don't come to conclusive answers on it. And that's something that God has not chosen to reveal to us fully for whatever reason. Does that at least give you, that's my best non-answer answer. That's a good question though. And I will say, Alex, that's a tough one in this passage. And even for me, I sit here and I'll say this publicly for everybody. As I've gone through personally Romans, especially Romans 9, 10, and 11, I've grappled with a lot of my own belief about, well, what is God doing here? Is Paul teaching that God has specifically elected some people to be saved, but also elected some people to go to hell? Because that would be rejection, right? If they die in rejection of God, that's hell. Is that what Paul is teaching? I don't know. I have some struggles with that based on other portions of Scripture. But also as I read it, and those are difficult things that we're all working through. And we can talk about that more fully if you want to. I just think it's a little bit outside of the scope of kind of what we're doing here at this point. But I guess what I'm just trying to say is I'm trying to be honest that I'm not going to sit here and pretend to have it figured out, because that would be an absolute lie. That's good. Any other questions? I almost said any other good questions, but they're all good questions. Go for it, Brennan.
So in verse 40, Pastor, it says,
14? Yeah.
If by any means I may provoke to emulation them which are my flesh. Doesn't that contradict the verse 5 and 6? Grace, the separation of grace and works.
Yeah, so the idea being that Paul's works would provoke other people to. So that's actually a really good question, Brennan. So the idea of the word emulation there really just has the idea of jealousy. That's what he's saying. He's saying, I'm trying to provoke them to jealousy. I don't think that Paul is saying that he's trying to contribute his own works to their salvation, because, and that's a great point. I think what you're trying to point out is, well, if they can't be saved by their own works, they also can't be saved by Paul's works either, right? They can only be saved by grace, which is absolutely true, right? We would all know that if you've lived in church and you've heard the gospel, right? We've all heard the preacher, you can't be saved because your parents were saved. You can't pray somebody else into heaven. Like, we get that. So how is Paul saying that he's taking his office as the apostle to the Gentiles seriously so that he can provoke? Paul's not saying he's going to provoke them to salvation. He's saying he's going to provoke them to jealousy, which is a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. Right? Isaiah prophesies that the nation will be jealous of the blessings that the Gentiles, the non-nation, the non-people, because the Jews very much disdained the Gentiles and looked at them very poorly. They weren't a real people group. They were just scattered and disorganized, right? But God blesses the people that the Jews looked down upon. And so Paul is saying, I am using my office to play into that prophecy. Now, later on, we're going to see how God utilizes that prophecy. He's not saying that jealousy is what brings him to salvation. He's saying well, he is, but not in that like, well, one Jew gets jealous and so they get saved. God is saying that jealousy is a part of his master plan of displaying grace and regrafting in the Jewish nation at a later date. Does that make sense? So it's not direct. Paul is not directly trying to get people saved by making them jealous. Paul is more saying, I'm working to fulfill the prophecy of God. That's why he lists out those prophecies. Paul didn't share those jealousy prophecies and then randomly mention jealousy later on accident. Those are absolutely interconnected in Paul's thought process. Does that answer your question? That was a really good question. And what's hard is a lot of that answer is going to be after where we stopped. So if you keep reading, you're going to see a lot of this unpack a little bit more. We read it earlier, but continue studying it. You're going to see a lot of that continue to unpack, and we'll talk about it in 2 weeks as well. Really good questions tonight, guys. I love this. Any other good questions? Any other bad questions? Or mediocre questions? All right, guys. Well, let's pray, and I'm going to let you guys split up into your small groups, and I hope that you'll take some time to share with your small group what impacted you as we studied through this together. Maybe what you saw a little bit differently compared to when I just stand up there and monologue for 45 minutes plus. But I hope that you enjoyed this. And then sincerely, give me some feedback. What were your thoughts on tonight? Did you miss the more preaching style? Did you enjoy this more discussion-oriented? How did you like being in a circle? I'm open to all the feedback. And let's do that. But let's have a word of prayer, and we'll split up into our small groups.